Hi, I'm George Norrie, and welcome to our Coast to Coast AM YouTube channel. Have fun, tell your friends, and share us with everyone. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Coast to Coast AM's mobile app. And always remember to log on to our website at coasttocoastam.com for daily articles, the best paranormal information, and all you need to know about your favorite guests. And now you can become a Coast Insider directly through the Coast mobile app. We welcome our international listeners and even offer a free 2-week trial. So don't delay. Become an insider today.
We're all a bit thunderstruck by the continuing wave, the avalanche of UFO news that's flowed over the past 5 years. And one of the journalists who's been forcing the ball down the field, moving the needle on the forefront of journalistic endeavors on this subject is our next guest. Ross Coulthart is a multi-award-winning investigative journalist with more than 3 decades experience in newspapers and television, including reporting for the Sydney Morning Herald newspaper, ABC TV Four Corners, 9 Network Sunday program, and 60 Minutes, 7 Network Sunday night. He's a 5-time winner of Australia's National Journalism Prize, the Walkley Award, and has written 5 books, best-selling books. His latest is In Plain Sight, an investigation into UFOs. Together with our friend, journalist Bryce Zabel, Ross has created a podcast called Need to Know that's carved out its own reputation and position in UFO news and commentary in the last year, and it's the latest incarnation of Need to Know is a UFO UAP road trip where these 2 investigators met with and interviewed some major names in the UFO field. You know, there's so much UFO news these days, it's hard to keep up with all of it. Even for those of us who've been chasing this for a long time, it's just a lot to absorb. It is yet another reason, though, I'm glad to know Ross Coulthart, a hard-charging investigative reporter who does keep up with all of it and has been breaking new ground on this still controversial subject for the past few years. Ross, great to have you here.
Great to be here, George. How are you, mate?
I'm good. Do you sometimes, you've been at this for a while now, do you sometimes have to pinch yourself to wonder, is this really happening or is this kind of a dream? All the different developments on so many fronts on the subject.
I do. I mean, it's funny because a lot of my journalist friends still look at me sideways and say, why are you doing stories on this weird subject? Because there's still that stigma, George, that's attached to the phenomenon, and I don't think it's legitimate. And I tell all my journo mates as much as possible that, frankly, this is a legitimate area for investigation. And I've even sent them, some of them, the PDF of the UAP task force report that was tabled in the Congress last year, just to show them that the Pentagon admits that the phenomenon, whatever it is, it's a genuine mystery. It's an authentic mystery. It's real, and it deserves to be investigated. So says the Department of Defense in your wonderful country.
And in your country, have your endeavors, the progress that you've made, the splash you've made with your coverage, I mean, it's grabbed public attention, at least that's my impression. Has it made a dent with your journalism colleagues? Is there others who are picking up the torch and chasing the story from their own angles?
There is a very small scattering of journalists who are starting to take an interest. It's interesting. I had a Washington correspondent for a major national newspaper, Cameron Stewart, contact me a few months ago, and he was very interested in doing a major feature about the subject. And we had a long chat, and he wasn't even aware of things like the UAP task force report, and I was really happy to brief him. He's a good friend of mine. And I think ultimately what's happening, George, is there's just so many years of stigma, decades of disinformation, deliberate disinformation, that I think has made the media think that this is a subject that should be ridiculed. But I'm very happy because the network that I work with, the 7 Network, which is Australia's largest commercial TV network, it's basically backing me to the hilt. I mean, they're very, very keen on the phenomenon. And the reason why, George, as you and I both know, is because they're getting record ratings. They are getting an absolutely stellar audience, huge audience numbers, because there is, I like to use the term, a wisdom of the crowd. People may not read this in their media, but the public sure as hell know what they want. Frankly, I'm kind of honoured to be in your show because you've been covering this beat for so many years, and I don't know how you do it because I find it exhausting. I get routinely hundreds of emails from people every day asking me, demanding my attention, asking me questions, insisting that I respond to them immediately. And a lot of it is raw, new information that, frankly, as a journalist, I'm thinking, crikey, I really do want to investigate this. And I'm overwhelmed. I've never had, in the career that I've done of 35, 36 years in investigative journalism, I've never had a response like this. People from all over the world are getting in touch, telling me they want me to investigate stuff. And I'm heartened by it because it's great. People recognise the need for, if you like, mainstream investigative journalism. I actually tip my hat, though, and doff my hat to people like yourself who've done it before me for many, many years. And there's a huge cadre of people, of course, online and Twitter and social media, Facebook, who've been doing this research for many, many years. And what's interesting, though, is I see a change. I see a definite shift. I'm getting discreet little phone calls from friends of mine all over the world. I'm a member of a journalists' organisation called ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists based in Washington, D.C. And there's about 200 or 300 journalists who do long-form investigative journalism who belong to that group, and we collaborate across borders, and we've done stories like the Panama Papers, Big Tobacco, stories that require crossing national boundaries. And now I'm finding I'm getting discreet little phone calls from my friends in that group. They're really interested to know more. I've had calls from people in the Indian subcontinent, across Europe, in America, and they're all starting to think, you know what, this is a story. Why don't we do this story? And frankly, when I go through it with them and I explain that there's been decades of quite deliberate disinformation led, sadly, by your sections of your intelligence services and Defence Department, and when I explain to them that they've been snowed and that there really is a legitimate story there, they're, I think, beginning to engage. But I think they're waiting to see what's going to happen next in Congress.
Well, as we both have learned, this story touches the pulse of the public in a way that we did not previously understand. It is so profound and so ongoing. It totally surprised me years ago when I first jumped into this, and it still surprises me. As you said, the number of messages I get, it's more leads than I would ever be able to pursue, not if I'm ever going to sleep again. In addition to that part of it, the public's ongoing hunger for information, you've got a tremendous learning curve for your colleagues who are just now dipping their toes into those waters, which I've always tried to encourage. Hey, look, there's a lot of work to be done for investigative journalists. This is a legitimate topic. Come on in. But there is a tremendous learning curve before you can get your head around this, isn't there?
Sure is. I mean, there's a huge stigma, and I guess that's why I wrote my book, In Plain Sight, because I started out freely. I freely admit, George, I was talking to Chris Mellon at the very moment that the New York Times ran its story. I'd heard about the fact that this was coming, and I thought, oh, this is really interesting. And when I was at the Australian 60 Minutes program, I approached Chris Mellon and asked him if he would do an interview, and he said yes. And we were booked to fly the following day, and I remember the boss of the program came to me and they said, look, I've decided you're not going to do the UFO story. And I said, oh, why? And they said, look, frankly, it's just, I think we'll get ridiculed. And I said, this is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence. This is a senior former official of the United States government saying UFOs are real. Why would we get ridiculed? And I think that's the problem, George, is that whilst people are engaging, and whilst I'm sure that there are journalists who are looking at my work and going, you know what, Coulthard isn't a tinfoil hat crazy. We'd better start taking this subject seriously. There is still in a lot of mainstream media, especially in newspapers, a stigma that's attached to this subject and a ridicule that is very, very hard to overcome. And I just don't know whether it's going to change until somebody is openly admitting in Congress to the truth of some of the things that we've been discussing and speculating about for years.
Well, we'll get into that. In your book, In Plain Sight, which the last time you and I talked was about that book a year or so ago when you were on the program, and you really pushed the edge of the envelope with government officials in your country, trying to find out what Australians know, where the files are hidden, and you made a great deal of progress there. But now your focus is largely on American angles to the story, on American sources, what's happening in Congress and in the Pentagon. Is that because there's so much happening here, or is it because, in effect, the Australian government and military kind of takes its cues from the U.S. Military and government?
It's exactly the latter, George. The issue is I speak routinely to people in Australian intelligence and defence who freely admit to me that the phenomenon is real. They are aware of anomalous objects, craft that they have tracked on radar, very sophisticated sensor systems, and it's a matter of open knowledge in our military, among certain sections of the military, that there are these anomalous objects. I recently had an F-35 pilot sitting in the very room that I'm sitting at the moment, telling me about the objects that he'd seen as an Australian fighter pilot. And I've had phone calls on background from people in the offices of ministers of our government, people at secretary level in our government, who are basically asking me what I think about the subject matter. And I think part of the reason why you quite correctly say that I'm pointing the focus at the Americans at the moment is because Australia does. We take our lead from our American friends and allies. And for a large part of the last 75, 77 years since World War II, Australia has recorded anomalous phenomena, and that's what I talked about in my book, that there is this incredible history of anomalous craft, discs, spheres, orbs being detected across Australia, especially on military bases, and these were recorded in Australian military files, which we obtained from our Defence Department and our National Archives. But what's interesting is, even now, even though the Pentagon has admitted that the phenomenon is authentic, it's real, the Australian government is basically putting its head in the sand and saying, we don't see any need to investigate this phenomenon. And this is very much at odds with what has been stated by your Pentagon. And so there's a bit of a push on at the moment. There are a lot of influential people in politics who've spoken to me privately who do believe that it's time we start engaging with this issue. One of them is a guy called Peter Whish-Wilson, who's a senator in the upper house of our parliament, and the Green Party that he represents controls a large part of the balance of power in the Senate. So they're powerful in a way that they weren't a year ago. And they're definitely keen to rattle the cage and ask questions. But really, frankly, a large part of the reason why I've directed my research at the United States is because a large part of the leadership on this issue at the moment, and I want to applaud it. I actually think that there are people in your Defence Department and intelligence services, some of whom I've been speaking to for some time, who do believe that this is a phenomenon, an issue that needs to be talked about. It needs to be investigated. And their official position, of course, is this is a genuine mystery. There are these anomalous phenomena. We can't explain it, and we think it should be investigated, and we acknowledge now, in defiance of years of saying the other thing, that it is a potential national security risk and it is a flight safety risk. And this is the argument that's being made in Australia as well. But I think that it's a slow, iterative process. It's chipping away. And I really think, George, a lot of people are looking towards your Congress, where you and I both know there's been private hearings where certain witnesses have given evidence to the congressional committees, like the House Intelligence Committee, the Senate Intelligence Committee, and the Armed Services Committee. And I think there is a very definite move happening at the moment where individual witnesses who want to give evidence about what they know are being given now by legislation the protections that they need to be able to come forward. And that's really exciting, because there's a lot of people who are very worried that if they do come forward, they're put in breach of a non-disclosure order or a national security oath that they've sworn for their lifetime, but they think the public have a right to know these UAP, UFO secrets, and they're puzzled as to why the public can't be told. Nobody can give me a good reason for why the public can't be told. And there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the United States government, I've had it admitted to me by multiple officials, it knows a hell of a lot more than it's letting on. It's definitely sitting on videos that it has shown in private skiff facilities inside the Congress and in certain briefings in the Defense Department. And those videos are quite dramatic, I'm told. They show craft that have been filmed by pilots with their mobile phones in some cases, and sometimes through optical sights and imaging from very sophisticated sensors on aircraft. And as the two witnesses from the Naval Intelligence admitted to your Congress in mid-May, there's now hundreds of these sightings that cannot be prosaically explained. They're not swamp gas, they're not balloons, they're not some meteorological phenomenon. They are a genuine mystery. And frankly, when you have pilots who are describing, as they have done, near-miss incidents with their aircraft where solid objects, hurtle between two planes with less than 30 or 40 feet either side of the wingtip, that's pretty frightening stuff. And pilots are genuinely and legitimately concerned that there's going to be a dangerous collision. And so this is why the Congress is now engaging with this subject matter really seriously. And I think it's only to be applauded. And I think the people who've pushed for this to come before the Congress, frankly, are heroes, and they're people to be admired. And some of them are people in your Defence Force and intelligence services, and they're people also like Lou Elizondo and Christopher Mellon. And frankly, I just find it bewildering that a large segment of UFO Twitter has spent several years questioning their motives and maligning them with conspiracy theories, nutty conspiracy theories, when frankly what they're about is basically letting the public find out what they know. And it's only to be applauded.
Ross, I was able to watch the Need to Know, this new episode, your road trip with Bryce Zabel, our mutual friend. I really regret not inviting Bryce on. I knew that you had a project that had aired on Australian national TV. I did not think he was part of it. And then when I saw this, I thought, well, gosh, I should have had Bryce too. We'll do that another time, the three of us. But let's talk a little bit about, for our audience members who aren't aware of your collaboration with Bryce, how that came about. During COVID, you'd never met each other, but you create a podcast that has already carved out its own niche in the UFO field, as it has made incredible progress in a short period of time, but you did it all remotely, right?
That's right, George. Both of us, I always admired Bryce from a distance, and as you know, he's a real big hitter in Hollywood, and I was kind of awed that he contacted me out of the blue once and said g'day, and it turned out he came to Australia actually during the bushfires that we had, and I was hoping to meet him then, but the road that he was travelling on to get to my city was so covered with smoke and fire that I think Bryce and his lovely wife Jackie were freaked out by the incredible Australian violence of the Australian native landscape, and they basically fled to Melbourne. So we never met each other until literally just a few weeks ago. Huh. And we've been collaborating in the Need to Know podcast, which anybody can access on www.needtoknow.today. And we've been doing, I think it's about 20 episodes now, where what we try and do is bring the journalist rigor to explaining the phenomenon and why it should be taken seriously. And it's really interesting. It's been very gratifying because the audience has exploded. We've had a huge volume of people contact us from all over the world. A large part of our audience, of course, is from America, but there's a lot of people from Europe, Germany, England, Sweden. And funnily enough, what they're responding to is what you and I do, George, which is basic nuts and bolts journalism. They like to hear analysis. They don't want to hear news necessarily unless it's backed with analysis. And it's put into context as well because Bryce, as you know, has this phenomenal understanding of the history of disclosure and the history of the issue. And so he's basically always reminding me that there's nothing in ufology that hasn't happened 20, 30, 70 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting because, you know, as we were observing for our most recent podcast, we're at a position now in history where everybody's saying this is unprecedented and, you know, it's something like this has never happened before. You know, the Congress is talking about holding inquiries. And as you and I both know, there were congressional inquiries 54 years ago, which were essentially a bit of a wet blanket. But even before that, you had the same phenomenon of Luis Elizondo type people coming from within the intelligence and defense establishment. One of my favorites is Roscoe Hillenkotter, who was the founding director of the CIA. And when Roscoe left the agency, he basically became a UFO transparency activist, which only leads one to wonder, what the hell is it that he knew as a director of the CIA that the rest of us aren't allowed to know, which made him determined to express the view that the United States government was covering up what it knew about the phenomenon, and that is 70 years ago. So I'm a little bit worried that we're all going to get snowed again, my friend, and that we're going to see the wool pulled over our eyes in Congress. And I thought that the efforts by Mr. Moultrie and Mr. Bray in the Congress in mid-May, albeit perhaps unintentional, they left me with the very distinct impression that the public should not get alarmed about this phenomenon, that ultimately, you know, it's probably going to be explainable. You know, Jeremy Corbell's videos that he trumpeted could be explained away as commercial drones. And not to worry, all we have is this one image of this sphere that is pretty vague and pretty opaque, and it's probably a weather balloon. So don't worry your tiny little heads about it and go away and get on with your lives and start watching Kim Kardashian the movies again and stop investigating this issue. I really got the strong sense that the two intelligence officials wanted to play down public interest in the phenomenon. And yet, as you and I both know now, George, behind the scenes, the Congress is angry. They're worked up, and this is why I wanted to come to America, because my sources are telling me, some of my sources are people who have very close knowledge of things that they think the public ought to know, and they tell me they've been approached by staffers on congressional committees asking them whether they'll be prepared to give evidence in the event that the Congress gets the legislation through the House, which allows them to protect informants. And it looks likely that that will be the case by the end of the year with the National Defense Appropriations for 2023. And as you know, there are these amazing new laws which are being proposed, some of which have already gone through the lower house, the Congress. And frankly, I'm really excited that early 2023, if these people are allowed to give evidence as they want to give evidence, we could potentially see some quite astonishing revelations in at least private hearings in the Congress.
I had the same reaction to that public hearing as you, that, you know, I was thrilled that it was happening after 54 years, but had low expectations to begin with. And somehow those two witnesses underperformed even my low expectations because they seemed remarkably uninformed, almost purposely so, as if they avoided any kind of a briefing because they didn't want to answer questions about certain things. And it was clear.
I just didn't. For me, the absolute kicker was when one of them said that he wasn't aware of the Admiral Wilson document. And I'm sorry, George, I just do not buy that. How could an official who purports to speak for the U.S. intelligence community, who's not aware of perhaps the most important smoking gun document that's come out in the last 20 or 30 years from this issue? I mean, this is an absolutely incredible document that records alleged conversations between a director of the DIA, a deputy director at the time, and a scientist, where he's making astonishing admissions about crash retrievals and hiding this technology away from the oversight of Congress in private aerospace. If that's true, you can see why some people in the Defense Department and the intelligence services of your country don't want this to be revealed. And incredibly, my friend, I'm convinced it's probably true. I mean, as you know from my book, I interviewed multiple people, but one of them was prepared to go on the record, and his name was Nat Kobitz. He was the former Director of Science Technology Development for the U.S. Navy, and he told me, sir, that he was briefed in to a crash retrieval program. He was read in to that compartmentalized top secret program and told that the United States had recovered multiple craft, non-human craft. Now, ever since he told me that, the revelations have been slowly emerging. Lou Elizondo talks about exotic technology. Dr. Eric Davis, a highly respected now government astrophysicist, has repeatedly talked about crash retrieval programs and attempts to reverse engineer alien technology. There are other people that I've spoken to confidentially who've told me that if the Congress allows them to, they will testify before the House. So there are, I think, there's the potential for quite astonishing revelations to be made. And I guess I'm not holding my breath because there's been so many disappointments in the past that this is going to happen soon. But gosh, if it does, the world will turn on its axis.
You know, the other thing that happened at that public hearing that these guys claimed ignorance about that was just astonishing is the UFOs over nukes, in particular the Malmstrom incident, where UFOs disabled nuclear weapons so that if we had gone to war, we couldn't use them. Something that Harry Reid, the late Senator Harry Reid, had talked to me about as one of the reasons why he secured funding for a secret program called OSAP. The fact that these two guys were sent before this congressional committee and claimed to have never heard of that was absolutely astounding to me. As you mentioned, the Eric Davis, the Davis-Wilson document is something that was also brought up that they claim to not know about. You dig into it with Bryce Zabel in this Need to Know episode. What did you learn on your UFO road trip about the Wilson-Davis memo?
Well, one of the things that I've always been very certain of, George, is the provenance of that document, because I met the guy who provided the document to my Australian colleague, James Rigney, who then passed it on to Grant Cameron, and the rest is history. And the spaceman, as I pseudonymously call this fellow, is a man who is passionate in his belief that Edgar Mitchell made admissions to him about crash retrieval programs, about alien flying saucers being seen by astronauts during their Apollo missions. And he says that Edgar told him, as a former senior pilot, lunar module pilot on Apollo 14, he told him that they were told as astronauts that it was treason to discuss this publicly, that to reveal this information to the American public was an act of treason. And the interesting thing is Edgar had this memo in his files when he died. And my friend, the spaceman, was allowed by the family to keep all these incredibly important archives. And this document came from those archives, and more importantly, the provenance of the document can be very clearly established because of the fact that Edgar had stashed these things literally in his files with the fax sheets from people who'd sent them to him. And I'm pretty clear from my reading of the files that either Hal Puthoff or perhaps Eric Davis himself sent this document to Edgar Mitchell shortly after the conversation that Eric Davis noted in his memo from 2002 with Admiral Tom Wilson. And I should emphasize, Admiral Thomas Wilson, who I am absolutely certain is an impeccable officer of your American Defense Department. I've got no doubt at all that he's a loyal and patriotic and decent human being. He is obliged, under the laws that operate with national security oaths, to lie about waived, unacknowledged special access programs, which is probably what this is, the biggest secrets of all inside the US military and intelligence services. And so there's no reflection at all on a very decent and, I'm told, extremely well-respected man like Admiral Tom Wilson, that he's publicly said that he never had a conversation with Eric Davis and that this memo must be a fake. But the interesting thing that came out in the course of my road trip was that one of the closest associates of Dr. Eric Davis, the person who allegedly wrote this memo recording allegations of a crash retrieval program made by an American admiral in the Defense Intelligence Agency, was Professor Gary Nolan from Stanford University. And Gary very kindly agreed to do an interview with me, and I hadn't given him a heads up that I was going to ask him about the Admiral Wilson document, but I thought, what the hell? He's being very kind with the time and the detail that he's giving me, so I asked the question. I said, are you aware of the Admiral Wilson document? And he said he was. And then in the course of the questions and answers that I put to him, he said that he was absolutely certain that Eric had the conversation that he had with Admiral Tom Wilson, and he was also certain that the events recorded in that memo were accurate and reflected a true history. And if that's true, and I said this to Gary, I said, if that's true, Professor, then we're talking about an absolutely monstrous secret that has been kept from the American public, possibly illegally, possibly criminally, away from the oversight of the US Congress, away from the oversight of General Accounting Office, oversight committees. And he said yes. And he said there has been a cover-up. He flatly asserted that there has been a cover-up and that he believes the Admiral Thomas Wilson document is real. And frankly, I would love nothing more than to see a patriotic, decent officer like Admiral Tom Wilson released of the constraints that he's under with his national security oath and allowed to give evidence before the Congress, because the only other explanation, frankly, is that the documents are hoax. And he, of course, has maintained that the documents are a hoax, but let's just see what he says if and when he's given the freedom to speak outside the constraints of his national security oath and outside the constraints of any undisclosed contractual non-disclosure agreements. I would love the people that are aware of this issue to be able to come forward. And frankly, also, George, I would like to see no recriminations against the people that have covered this up, if this is true, because it doesn't serve any useful purpose.
We're having a fascinating conversation with investigative journalist Ross Coulthart of Australia, who, along with his cohort, partner in crime, Bryce Zabel, put together this latest episode of Need to Know, a UFO road trip where they talked to some leading personalities and investigators on the subject matter, including Dr. Gary Nolan, Jeremy Corbell, Ben Hansen, and Ryan Graves, a military aviator who all of those witnesses dropped some bombs in the course of this conversational but powerful documentary. We're going to dig in a little bit deeper on some of what we learned, including from Dr. Gary Nolan, who revealed he'd had some personal experiences that I had never heard before, and then take a little bit deeper dive into this Wilson Davis memo, its legitimacy. I'll tell you where I stand on it. And as mentioned, Ross and Bryce put together this Need to Know episode, and one of the topics they dug into in detail was what we were just talking about, this Wilson Davis memo. Admiral Wilson, who had been high up in the DIA, was complaining to Dr. Eric Davis that basically is complaining that he was not allowed in on the program, the crash retrieval program, that he was kept out despite his high security clearances and his high position, which I think just the fact that he was griping about it makes the memo more credible. I would add, Ross, I don't know if you know, but I've known Eric Davis for more than 25 years. I know the circle of people that he would have shared that memo with, including Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the source of the leak of the material. I think it's legit. I have good reason to believe it's legit. It's not something that Eric made up. He was recording, notes from an actual meeting that took place here in Las Vegas. And I would be interested to know if there's an actual recording, an audio recording, which would that would certainly stir things up, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, George. And in fact, one of the things that's recorded in the memo is Admiral Wilson says, "What are you going to do with that?" And it's interesting because I took, when I was doing my analysis of the document, I took from that the possibility that Eric had a digital recorder rolling. Now, one of the things that a number of associates of Eric have told me is that Eric Davis has a phenomenal recall.
True.
They also tell me he's absolutely incapable of lying. But the thing about the the memo that astounds me is that it reads like a transcript. It reads like the notes have been typed out from specific sections of dialogue and that they've basically put it into a memo form. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if there was a digital recording of that conversation. And I know that people who are close to Eric Davis, including Professor Gary Nolan, have vouched for his integrity and said that there is absolutely no way that he can speak publicly about this issue because he doesn't want to be put on the spot about the memo, because he can't call Tom Wilson a liar because clearly, obviously, this memo was never intended for public release. And basically, I know now the full circumstances of how that memo came into the public domain. One of the things that, as a journalist, you often check is the provenance of a document. You look for ways that that document could have been hoaxed along the way. But because I'm very, very sure of where the document came from, because there's a long history in Edgar Mitchell's files, which I have a full copy of, they show regularly that as a member of the Science Advisory Committee for NIDS, the National Institute of Discovery Science, Edgar was sent little bits of information by Hal Puthoff, Dr. Hal Puthoff. And both Hal and Eric Davis have been conspicuous in their reluctance to doubt the veracity of the memo. Hal, in fact, at a function on the East Coast, I quote this in my book, he made reference to the memo and appeared to validate its authenticity. But he then backed down from that because, of course, you don't want to put Eric on the spot about this. I'm told I've never had the privilege of interviewing Eric, but by golly, I'd love to. And I look forward to the day eventually that we can. But I think the difficulty at the moment, frankly, is that the crash retrieval program, if it exists, and I suspect it does, if it exists, the United States is in possession of technology that is world-changing. And I've done an analysis of Eric Davis's interviews, notably with Alejandro Rojas from some years ago. And in his interview with Rojas, he basically acknowledges that there's been a crash retrieval program. It was shelved, he claims, in 1989 briefly because they weren't getting anywhere. And if you think about it, George, let's assume for a moment that this incredible conspiracy theory is true. Let's assume that the United States did recover alien spacecraft over multiple years in the 40s and the 50s. And let's assume that there has been a massively funded secret program going on inside secret facilities where they're trying to back-engineer this technology. I'm told, and this is what Eric said in his interviews with Rojas, that frankly the technology, whatever it is, has confounded the scientists that have tried to replicate it. That it really is something beyond human ken, beyond human understanding. And so maybe the simple fact is that they've had this technology for 70 plus years. They don't want to admit it.
You know, the crash retrieval program, the actual hardware, I started reporting on that back in 1989, saying that some of that material, some of those craft were here in Nevada. And, I took all kinds of grief for it back then. I believed the story then to be true. I more firmly believe it to be true now. It's the Holy Grail. It's the whole ball of wax. If that program is real and can be proven to be real, and I believe that there is a long list of people who are standing by to tell that to Congress, who will give firsthand information to congressional hearings and perhaps even to the public if they get necessary protections, whistleblower protections. That's the whole story there. If there's material, craft that is technology beyond anything we have, materials that we did not manufacture, maybe even some elements that are unobtainium-type elements that don't really exist on our periodic chart, well, that says it all. I think that we have a chance to make real big breakthroughs on that particular issue. It's something that you dig into in this Need to Know episode. Dr. Gary Nolan, that interview was a terrific interview. You got him to talk about not only those kind of programs, things that have covered up, but also secrets of a personal nature, experiences that he had. Really surprised me. I had never heard those stories before, and it surprised me that he would come clean with them because it does open him up to a whole lot of kind of attacks that are all too common in dealing with this subject.
You know, you're absolutely right, George, and I was nervous for Gary when he made the admissions he made. Now, before I go into that, I just want to make the point, because you're very correctly pointing out that there are people who are saying that there are witnesses who are prepared to come forward, and one element in the Gary Nolan interview that he gave me was he acknowledged that the reason that he knows that the Admiral Wilson document is real, one of the reasons that he's aware of a crash retrieval program is because he's spoken to the whistleblowers who are about to give evidence to the Congress. That's the real thing that's come out in my interview with Gary Nolan. And if that wasn't enough, he then went on to tell me that he was an experiencer himself, and that he, as a very young child, the first experience that he had that he described to me was just breathtaking. I mean, George, I know you have, but I mean, for me, it's a very unusual thing to have conversations with people who've described alleged direct contact with non-human entities. But a few years ago, I interviewed a very senior official of the FBI, your Federal Bureau of Investigation, and he admitted to me that he and his wife had had extraordinary experiences with non-human entities in their bedroom. Somehow something had come to visit them in their bedroom at night. I've had other conversations with people, and what really floored me in my interview with Gary was when I knew off camera he told me about this experience, and I felt guilty asking him about it during the interview. But the thing I really admire about Gary is he has a scientific rigor. He's not going to lie. He's not going to distort. He's just the sort of guy you want investigating the phenomena. And he told me that in his childhood, he had an experience that he concedes may have been a dream, although his body language told me that he didn't think it, where essentially there was the classic grey alien face, the big-headed, large-eyed, small-nose, minimal-mouth face of the grey alien. And he told me that the only way that he realised that it was the alien grey that he was seeing as a little boy was when he finally, 20 years later, as a scientist browsing bookstores in Palo Alto, where he works at Stanford University, he came across a copy of Whitley Strieber's Communion, and there on the cover is that classic big-eyed, big-headed, small-nosed, small-mouthed, non-human entity, and they call them the Greys. And if that wasn't enough, he also then told me that when he was doing a paper delivery, he had an experience where he had to deliver newspapers to a guy who was on the other side of a small forest, and then he had to ride back through the forest in order to get back to the rest of his delivery. And he tells the story incredibly well of how, as he was cycling along, little Professor Nolan in shorts basically says he became aware of his shadow being illuminated from behind, and that he was being illuminated from something up above him. And when he looked up, he saw some kind of craft with lights underneath that was hovering above him in the forest. And he says, indisputably, that for him was real. Now, I admire Gary and having the courage to speak out about that, because there are a lot of people, and a lot of people have, a lot of people mock this phenomenon. A lot of people say that experiencers aren't having these experiences, that it's some kind of delusion. And the professor, the scientist in Gary, acknowledged that the incident that happened to him when he was a little boy, when he had the Greys allegedly in his bedroom, he said, look, that might have been a dream. He conceded the possibility that it might have been a dream. But because he was awake riding his bicycle as an older boy, I think he was about 10 or 11 years old, he told me, when he was riding through the forest, he's adamant that what happened to him was real, that there was some kind of illuminated object with lights underneath hovering along above him. And then more recently, during his professional career as a professor, a very well-respected, internationally renowned immunologist, a Nobel Prize nominee, no less, he was in London in a hotel room, and he had this weird experience where he woke up and his whole body was buzzing, vibrating, and he was really quite distressed by the way that this was going on. And a lot of people have told me that this is some form of higher consciousness, that if you want to communicate, with phenomena like CE5, this is the way you do it. Frankly, I don't know. But the interesting thing is that he says that as this was happening to him and his body is vibrating, his whole body is feeling this vibration, this frequency coming through him, he hears a voice in his head saying, "This is how you communicate." And then he asks for it to stop, and it does immediately. And I think it's incredibly courageous for a scientist of Professor Nolan's renown to speak publicly about those three individual incidents. I really admire him for doing it. And I know it was a big decision. He trusted me to do it, but it was a big decision, frankly, for him to decide to speak publicly. And it's interesting because, I've stayed away from the experiencer issue. I'm a bit of a coward, to be honest, George. I can deal with technology. I can deal with the idea of recovered technology. But when people like that FBI guy I told you about earlier have told me about the aliens in their bedroom, I deliberately didn't put it in my book. And I frankly don't know why. I was a bit pathetic about it. I was scared of the fact that, frankly, there's no scientific way that I can investigate it. At least with technology, I can speak to people, as I did with, like, Knapp, for the former Director of Science Technology Development for the US Navy, who can confirm that they were, quote, read into a classified program that dealt with retrieved non-human technology. But how do you deal with people who claim abduction experiences or experiences? And I've felt, frankly, a little bit dishonest as a journalist because a huge cohort of people have contacted me from all over the world claiming direct contact with the phenomenon. And one of the things I tried to do in my story that we put to air on Australian TV recently was I've long known a guy called Damien Knott who, interestingly, suffered terrible injuries, shocking physical injuries, as a result of an exposure to a UAP, some kind of glowing orb that manifested in his backyard when he was filming it, and suffered the most horrendous burns on his body. And I've long been interested in that story. And a few months ago, Damien told me that he'd been contacted by a Dr. Akilo Wirisaka. I apologize if I've got that name pronunciation wrong, but he's a Harvard University scientist who, as I discovered when I was talking to Gary, is actually working in conjunction with Gary at Stanford University, investigating military officials, intelligence officers, a wide range of people, including military pilots, who've had direct contact with the phenomenon that on occasion has caused them very serious physical injury. And this fascinates me because, to me, it's a way of being able to investigate people who claim to have direct contact with the phenomenon because they're suffering physical injuries. What is it, this injury, if it's not direct contact with some kind of phenomenon that may not be of this world?
It could be, Ross, that that will be the last holdover of stigma, is the experiencers and their stories. We can all understand as reporters, we can understand the paper trail that leads to a crash retrieval program, witnesses who are willing to say, I saw it, military witnesses who say, I ran this sensor, we detected UFOs, we recorded images. Those things make sense. The experiencer stories are harder to digest. And, it may be that they are the ones who are the only ones who are stigmatized in the future, that suddenly UFO incidents and sensor reports become acceptable and respectable, whereas experiencer stories are still subjected to ridicule. You know what it's like on UFO Twitter, the kinds of things that people get attacked for. You're a government agent, you're a stooge, you're making this up, you're just trying to make money, all that stuff. The experiencers who have one-on-one communication get the worst of it. And it could be that the entire experience is really about that one-on-one communication rather than lights in the sky. Ross Coulthard, thanks. It's great always to talk to you. Next time you come back, we'll have Bryce Zabel with you as well. Thank you. Appreciate it.
The Coast mobile app is now available for download on iPhones and Android devices. You can become an insider directly through this app. This is a great option for our international listeners, and new users will also receive a free 2-week trial.